I guess we have to get over it because it's not based upon our powers of interpretation. And so if God and the way he had the Bible written doesn't fit in my interpretive box, then I better step out of my box. And even if it seems to be wild, listen, I'm not overhauling the entire theological framework of Christianity, by doing this. I keep on bringing this up. We are asking questions in the 21st century that a 17th century Christian would not have had any interest in answering. They had their own set of questions that they're concerned about. We are framed in our empirical scientific framework, and so we're superimposing that framework upon the Bible. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm simply saying that we have to look at it and realize, but that's not the framework that the writers were using. So if I find out, that's interesting, the flood narrative has 150 days here, it has 150 days there, that doesn't fit my model, well, I better change my model then.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Buried Bible Podcast. We are glad you're back. We, if you can't tell, have never left. We stayed here, and so we're doing another episode on the flood. And I'm next to him, this guy, Dodgers loyalist, Mark Chavalas.
Loyalist, that's a good one.
Yeah.
We're still in the flood because you're like a dog on a tire. You won't let go.
Whatever. Again, Mark talks about what he wants to talk about and then just uses me as a scapegoat because he's so scared that you guys might not like the fact that we're talking about it. I was forced against my will. Baloney. I'm the one forced against my will.
But you are a scapegoat.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, hopefully these next couple episodes we get flooded with questions. Not bad. Hey. I'll be here. Well, at this rate, I will be here all day. So I'll turn it over to you. We're still looking at the biblical flood. What are we looking at specifically in this episode?
Well, I have two things I want to talk about, and we'll see how far we get with both of them. One is something called the coherence of the story. The flood is through 4 chapters, all right? And the actual, what I haven't been talking much about, and I'm still not going to go into a deep dive into it, is the actual events of the flood. How long was the flood? How many animals, were there 7 pairs? Were there 2 pairs? Was the flood 40 days and 40 nights? Was it 150 days? All of these questions, and people have tried to reconcile all these numbers, and they don't seem to reconcile perfectly, but people have done tremendous mental gymnastics because their goal is to make sure that everything maps out perfectly. Otherwise, it wouldn't be good scripture. In other words, it wouldn't be God if it wasn't correct and orderly. In the 19th century, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, scholars came up with the idea that there were multiple traditions that came together to create the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. The thesis is there were at least 4 different sources they call JEDP. I don't want to go into all the details about this. And so there was a priestly source, there was a source in the north, a source in the south, etc., and then there was a Deuteronomy source. And so the idea is that there are a number of narratives in the Bible that seem to be repetitive or repeated with a story that's not precisely like the previous story. And so, for example, they argue that Genesis 1 and 2 are 2 separate creation accounts. I talked a little bit about this to try to show that just doesn't fly. I'm not opposed to the idea that there are multiple traditions that have been woven together to create Genesis. I think in principle that's not a problem. What I have a problem with is thinking that it's done the way that the modern scholars have seen it. I think when you look at Mesopotamia and you look at, for example, the Gilgamesh epic, it clearly has multiple traditions of Gilgamesh that have been woven together to create a coherent narrative. Incidentally, the flood story seems to be one of the stories that doesn't fit very well in the narrative, but that's another issue. So in the Genesis account, I'm going to ask you to try to take a look at the actual events of the flood in a literary way, and this is something that is going to be bothersome to us. There are usually some certain literary formulas and canons that are used in the Bible that basically what they do is they take their historical narrative or cosmic narrative and they place them within the literary structures that they have. It's kind of like, I don't know if you write any poetry, but let's just say you write poetry. If you're going to write some poetry, what you're going to do is you're going to write it through the established designs. Well, it has to rhyme. It has to be like, line 1 and line 3 have to end up rhyming. Line 2 and line 4 have to rhyme. I'm being really elementary right now. But the point is there are certain patterns, and you have content that you want to put in there, but it has to be done by the established, literary patterns. And by the way, if this sounds really elementary, it's because that's about as far as I get with stuff like this. And I have a daughter who ended up being an English major, and so it's really been fun for us to talk about, historical context. If she talks about Shakespeare, I'm talking about context. She said, no, the content, Dad, the content, and I'm thinking, well, you can't have the content without the context. And she's saying, well, the context is irrelevant if you don't have content. I said, okay, well, can it be true that the Bible is the same thing? Can you have literary formulas that are used? I mean, really, is it any different than let's say Handel wanting to create a symphony? You can't create a symphony unless you use the established musical canons for writing symphonies or an opera or whatever it is. And so he's not going to go away from those canons so easily. And his content, by the way, is usually something that has already been established. In other words, he doesn't make up his content out of thin air. He'll just like Shakespeare, he'll usually take something that is a traditional story, either Hamlet or Julius Caesar or Cleopatra or someone, they're taking the story and they put a new twist on it. What about the Bible? When you read about the kings, it is put in a particular established canons. You usually start off with talking about the king, how long he reigned, when he died, who his mother was, because that's always important. Then you're given a brief account of his reign. Then he's graded as to whether he's a good king or not, usually in comparison to David, if he's the southern king, etc. And then if you want more information, you're told where you can get that other information. I'll paraphrase, if you don't want to know more about King so-and-so, is the information not found in the books of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel, which, by the way, is the Royal Annals. It's not the Book of Chronicles. And so we don't even have, in other words, he's giving us his footnotes, but we don't know where to find his footnotes. Bummer. But each king has to be put in that box, that established box. It doesn't make what he writes less historical. Is that possible that that's happening with the flood narrative? Well, one of the guys who wrote a Genesis commentary that I think I brought up before, Gordon Wenham, in his Word Biblical Commentary, wrote a really great commentary on the first, I think 17 or 18 chapters of Genesis. I can't remember. He wrote the second volume also. He also wrote an interesting article, and by the way, this is almost 50 years ago. It's not exactly new news. It's sort of old and crusty. He wrote an article in 85, in a journal called Vetus Testamentum. I think I brought it up before. It's a Dutch publication. Literally, it just means Old Testament in Latin. The coherence of the flood narrative. Okay, so what is he? To me, this is what's more important. I can look for all the possible sources, but the end result, and I think I got this from a colleague of mine, Jack Sasson, is that you really want to look at the final edition is what's important. That's the thing that they have. How did it get there? And look at the brilliance of the writer, because, the Bible also has beautiful literary quality to it. It's entertaining. Okay. So this is what he said in this. He wrote this in the 80s. I think it's about 1985. I forgot to look at the date here. He says, when Genesis 6 through 9 is dissected into its sources, two new versions of the flood story are produced. This is the traditional view, which differ both from each other and from the version we now find in other versions, etc. So in a recent study of Hebrew syntax, F.I. Anderson questioned the value of the documentary analysis of Genesis at certain points. He says, the flood story divided into two parts, J and P, doesn't make a lot of sense. And so he says, either they assign parallel passages to different sources as doublets, thus destroying the fabric of the composition, or else they speak disparagingly of its tedious redundancy, in which, by the way, we find lots and lots of redundancy even in the flood story. And part of it might be attributed to the fact that this is being orally transmitted, and the best way for you to understand things is to hear it a second time and maybe even a third time. Then it sort of cements in your head, kind of like when you sing a song and there's 3 or 4 stanzas and that refrain always is coming in. It gives you that time to remember it, and of course, after a while, it's cemented into your head. So here's what Wenham said. By the way, this is volume 28, and like I said, I forgot to put the date down, but I know it's probably about I think this is 1978 actually, so it's almost 50 years old. So it was before he wrote his commentary. So on page 337, he says, one mark of the coherence of the flood narrative is to be found in its literary structure. Oh, literary structure. I don't want to do that. That's too hard. But I think it's necessary, So in other words, the way it's being presented is just as important as the actual content itself. Okay. And we don't like that, I think, especially as Bible people. Just give me the answers, give me the content, and the writer's saying, yeah, but the way I presented it is just as nice. It's kind of like reading poetry. You don't read poetry just for its content, which is, of course, really great. It's the way it's being presented. I don't know. It's kind of like reading a Jane Austen novel. If you simply look at the events, it's like, okay, this happened and that happened. No, it's the way that she actually brought it out and the way that she presents her characters and how they speak. It's like, wow, that's really cool. We don't do that anymore. Well, the Bible is part of that, and this is why I think I brought up many times, Robert Alter, who has done his translation of the entire Old Testament from a literary standpoint, and he thinks that the King James was a really, really cool excellent literary piece, for the 17th century. Yes, of course, it's out of date in terms of precision, but it was a brilliant literary exercise, which most translations of the Bible are not any longer. Then he bemoans that fact. All right, back to this Wenham on page 337. He says, the tale, meaning the tale of the flood, is cast in the form of an extended. He doesn't use this term; he uses the term palistrophe, but I'm going to use the word chiasm. Chi. This comes from the word chi in Greek. The letter chi is it looks like an X. It's the chaos sound. All right, So anyway, and of course, why it's called an X is because you have an X. You start at one top and you go to the bottom, and then you have to go to one side and go to the other bottom. In other words, you have two opposite things that are connected in the middle. And so a chiastic structure is a structure that turns back on itself. In other words, you start off with a typical structure would be, let's say an easy one would be, you have Noah, you have the ark, and then you have the flood waters rising. Then you have the middle of it where Noah is talked about again as a righteous man. Then you have the flood waters receding. Then you have the ark, and then you have Noah's family, and then you have Noah. In other words, it starts off with a topic, then a second, and a third, fourth topic, and then the fourth topic is brought first, and then the third topic, and the second topic, and the first part. In other words, they go in reverse order. Okay, I know I'm saying it terribly. It's the best I can do. I better get back to just reading some of what he says. And so he says in a palistrophe, I'm gonna just use the word chiasm because I think it's a more common term. The first item matches the final item. The second item matches the penultimate item, and so on. The second half of the story is thus a mirror image of the first. Okay, almost. And when I say mirror image, it's the opposite. Think about it. When you look at yourself in the mirror, your whole face it's the opposite direction of what everybody else sees. Okay. You probably didn't know that, so I had to tell you. So this kind of literary structure has been discovered in other parts of Genesis, but nowhere else is it developed on such a large schedule as it was in Genesis. So he says Genesis 6:10, which is the beginning of the flood, to 9:19 appears to be a chiasm containing 31 items. Now that's a lot of items. That's a ridiculously long amount of items, and this is probably why it's not so easy to see, although English literature people probably will find this a lot faster than anybody else if they have to think about it. It begins and ends with a reference to Noah. Then Noah's sons are named, and so on. Particularly striking are references to days. The periods of time form a symmetrical pattern. 7, 7, 40, 150, 150, 40, 7, 7. The turning point of the narrative in the middle is found in chapter 7, verse 1. Then God remembered Noah. By the way, when it means God remembered Noah, it doesn't mean that he was doing something else. Oh yeah, Noah. That's not what it means, of course. It means that he now will act on his knowledge. He will act on Noah at this point. Okay, Chris, for us, for us to remember something, it means that it was out of our head and it was brought back to our head. Well, nothing can be out of God's head. So it means he's now ready to act on the event. So this is a chiasm on a grand scale. And now this is going to be a little tedious, and maybe but I'm going to show you what it is. He letters them A through, let's see. A through N, I guess. No, I'm sorry, P. A through P. A through O, and then P is in the middle, and then O through A prime is the second part. So just to show you what it's like. So chapter 6, verse 10, Noah. Chapter 6, verse 10b, his family, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. C would be the ark being built. That's chapter 6, 14 through 16. There's an interlude in between. Number D is the flood is announced, verse 17. Number E is God's covenant with Noah, 18 through 20. By the way, people might be able to quibble with the details of his chiastic arrangement, but I don't think that you can quibble against the chiasm. At least that's how I look at it. G, there's a command to enter the ark. That's chapter 6, chapter 7, 1 through 3. H, 7 days waiting for the flood. I, chapter 7, verses 4 through 5. And then I, 7 more days waiting for the flood. Why are they doing it again? It's to abide by the chiastic structure in my argument. As soon as I realize that the goal is to, numerically speaking, to abide by the chiastic structure, then that is probably going to trump an argument about numbers, if that makes any sense. So what's next? All right, J, entry into the ark, 7 verses 11 through 15. K, Yahweh shuts Noah in, chapter 7, verse 16. L, 40 days of the flood, 17a. M, waters increase, chapter 7, verses 17 and 18. N, mountains are covered, 19 and 20. O, 150 days the waters prevail, verses 21 through 24 in chapter 7. Now, it's actually 8:1 where God then remembered Noah. In other words, this is the datum point. And at that point, so in other words, the flood has happened. The waters have continued to move up. There's 40 days of the flood. The waters are increasing. The mountains are covered. 150 days, the waters prevail. And then God remembered Noah. In other words, I'm done with this. Now it's time to go and start the next process. And so what happens right after God remembering Noah? 8:3, 150 days, the waters abate. In other words, if they rise for 150 days, they have to abate for 150 days. This is literary structure. Is it to be taken literally? I don't know. I have no idea. I'm going to let you geologists worry about that. And I know that you have worried about it, and the chronology people are do all sorts of jobs trying to figure out how to, to match all these things, mix and match them to make them correct, and to come out with a flood being, I think, 371 days or whatever it is. Maybe it was. Guess what? Next, the mountaintops, they were covered. Now they're visible in chapter 8, 4 through 5. That's N prime. M prime waters began to abate. They increased in the previous one. L prime, 40 days at the end of this, 8.6a. K prime, Noah opens the window of the ark, 6b. Oh, it closed the ark in the same place in this chiasm. J prime, the raven and the dove leave the ark. What was before? Oh, that was the entry of the ark. So now there's leaving the ark. The specifics are different, but the topic is the same. I prime, 7 days waiting for the waters to subside, 10 to 11. Guess what? H prime, 7 more days waiting for the waters to subside. Are these two separate 7 days? I don't know, but it abides by the same structure, and for whatever reason, there has to be 15 topics and then another 15 topics, plus Noah's 31. That number evidently is significant. I don't know why, by the way, in this particular case. But the writer is creating a literary masterpiece, in my opinion. G prime, command to leave the ark, verses 15 through 17. Just like the command was to go into the ark in 7, 1 through 3. F prime, food outside the ark, 9, 1 through 4. There was food in the ark before that, in 7:21. Actually, 6:21, excuse me. E prime, covenant with all flesh. Covenant with Noah before, now it's the covenant with everyone. Covenant to covenant. D prime, no food in the future. No, I'm sorry, no food. I missed the L. No flood in the future. Maybe I should know what the topic is. There'll be no food in the future. No flood in the future. There was a flood, announced before. C prime, the ark is to be mentioned, just like it was mentioned when it was being built. B prime, the family is mentioned once again, and then A prime, Noah is mentioned at the very end of 9:19. I think it's brilliant. And in fact, Wenham says it actually works pretty well because it's the story falls into two halves, which of course makes a lot of sense. You go in the ark, there's a big flood, and then God remembers Noah, and then the waters have to go down. So in other words, it wasn't real hard to make this, except that if that's the case, then the literary structure of the event is more important than whether or not you can resolve all the... in other words, these are not two traditions. They're repetitive on purpose. And let's see if I have a few more statements that he makes that I thought were interesting. Yeah, you have to do something with this. Total formlessness is incomprehensible, from this standpoint. And so when you do this, I think worrying about whether or not the passages are coherent is hard. to argue. Now, let me go with his conclusions on page 347 and following. He says, the syntax, literary structure, chronology, and Mesopotamian parallels all point to the unity and coherence of the account of the flood found in Genesis 6 through 9. And now, he also says none of these observations is absolutely incompatible with the idea that Genesis was compiled from more than one source. And so that's perfectly fine. Yet a simpler, more economical hypothesis would have much to commend it. 3 recent studies of other parts of Genesis have suggested that it's better to think in terms of one epic source, which has been reworked by a later priestly editor. And I fall into that camp right now, and I think it's a camp which ancient Near Eastern people would work. And so it would explain both why the Genesis flood story has so many narrative elements in common with the Mesopotamian ones, and why it contains literary and syntactic features in common with the rest of Genesis. That's about as far as I can get with that. So, and I've already exhausted my literary knowledge on that, but
is that literary? What is it called?
Chiastic, yeah. Building a chiastic structure, which, by the way, is found in other places in the Bible. It's often used in Psalms and other places, but it's usually smaller. It's like A, B, C, C prime, B prime, A prime.
Because that was going to be my question. Do we see it in other ancient Near Eastern writings?
Yes, yes, but it's more pronounced here in the Bible, and it's often done, I think, for an audience that is non-literate. In other words, they can hear it better. When you do things like that, and by the way, this is why the Bible is so often intertextual and we forget about it. And so this is why, for example, what I brought up in the last podcast, when God has got pain in his insides, and it's the same verb used for a woman having pain in her insides, and that was just a couple chapters earlier when you're listening to this, it alerts you to think and connect those two items. Like, oh, God's pain is like a woman's pain in labor. Wow, that's pretty intense. That must mean they're really trying to tell me something about God that's really intense. And so those connections are all over the place in the Bible, and they're easily overlooked, I think. And when we don't make those connections, I think that we're prone to make either wrong conclusions or usually more so miss things rather than make mistakes. Mm. So I think in the flood narrative, to ask, how do we resolve all these supposed contradictions in the flood? And,
what are the biggest ones? Just in case, maybe don't even bring them up if people don't know, but what would be the big arguments?
The pairs of animals, are there 2 pair, are there 7 pair? How many days, why are 7 days mentioned twice? Why are 40 days mentioned twice? 150 days mentioned twice? In other words, does it make sense to have the waters, rise for 150 and then decline for 150? Is that what the norm is? Well, I don't know what the norm is, but it clearly is literary structure, and so to me, before I even try to resolve all the issues concerning the supposed contradictions, if I understand that they're using a type of literary device like this, I think it makes some of those issues melt away or seem less consequential. Then I'm not prone to try to resolve all the apparent contradictions. I mean, they're all over the place. We have multiple stories. I mean, why is the story about, why do we have multiple counts? Think about it. The same thing is happening when you look at the Synoptic Gospels, where they're talking about the same story multiple times. Wait a minute, what's going on here? Why is this happening? How do I resolve this? Genesis 16 and what is it, 21, where the story of Hagar fleeing. Why does she have to flee twice? And what does that make? Is there one flight or is there multiple flights? When you look at it from a literary standpoint, it makes those questions less potent, I think. or, and I realize, oh, maybe I'm shouldn't be nearly as worried about this issue. Does that lessen the Bible? No, I think it accentuates the Bible. And I'm a novice at this. I'm just beginning to learn how to do this and understand this stuff.
Because would somebody say, though, if you're going to add that literary device, if that's the purpose of it, does that change our interpretation then? Would that allow for an easier allegorizing of the flood account itself? You know what I mean?
It would. I think it would tweak it, but I think the writer is clearly intending to give you a bird's eye historical event about something in primeval history, and so it's no different than writing about a king in 1 Kings or an event in 1 Samuel that is also put in a literary device context. It's a different one than this one, but in other words, they're using certain literary forms and they're plugging their history into those literary forms. We have a problem with this because that's not what historians do. If I write you a history of, I don't know, World War II, but I put it in prose in poetic narrative, you're going to say, no, just give me the facts. I said, no. The way I do it is just as important. Am I going to use poetic license once in a while? Yeah, maybe I am. Does that throw the World War II story out because I use poetic license? No. I think that we just have to, I don't even want to me, I don't even worry about the supposed contradictions because until after I go through this type of lens. If I realize that there's a chiastic structure here, it sort of it makes me start over in starting to look at it. And then again, it's the same thing with Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 1 and 2 are, I think, answer two different questions. And so they're not two separate creation narratives. We talked about this months ago, in our very early podcasts. Is that they're not trying to, we have this one tradition about God and creating the whole universe. We have this other tradition about him creating humanity. And the guy tried to weave it together and it didn't really work out very well. And so there seems to be contradictions, in this and that. And of course they miss the whole point is that, one is, they're brought together for the impact of what it means as a whole. So I think the same thing could be going on here.
Yeah, because I feel like people don't like that to look the literary style because then
I don't like it
mainly because if it's not actually 150 days, the Bible said 150 days. So then I think it's really easy, and maybe again, us moderns, us not understanding divine inspiration the way they believed it or thought of it back then, or just I guess not even thought about it back then, just the reality of what divine inspiration means, which is even if it's not a literal 150 days, it's like semantics. It's like, well then, yes, well see, the Bible's wrong though. It wasn't 150 days. Kind of, but not really, because not the point. But then I think we're fearful of, as soon as we give in to any of those, then it's, well, then how can you take anything literally? But, right? Isn't that?
Yes, I know.
Where it goes from there?
And my answer is, I guess we have to get over it because it's not based upon our powers of interpretation. And so if God and the way he had the Bible written doesn't fit in my interpretive box, then I better step out of my box. And even if it seems to be wild, listen, I'm not overhauling the entire theological framework of Christianity, by doing this. We're talking about, twigs on one tree in the entire forest that we're working through to try to understand them. It helps me, provides an interpretive framework, because we're coming in at, we're asking questions. I keep on bringing this up. We are asking questions in the 21st century that a 17th century Christian would not have had any interest in answering. They had their own set of questions that they're concerned about, that were much more important to them than ours. We are framed in our empirical scientific framework, and so we're superimposing that framework upon the Bible. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm simply saying that we have to look at it and realize, oh, but that's not the framework that the writers were using. Does that, and really, I brought this up before too. You use the phrase Bible is inerrant. It's inerrant. It's infallible. Well, the Bible actually doesn't use those phrases. Those are all negative phrases. They use positive phrases. The Bible is the power of God to provide salvation. That's Romans 1:16 and 17. You start there, and everything else, so if I find out, oh, that's interesting, the flood narrative has 150 days here, it has 150 days there, that doesn't fit my model, well, I better change my model then, to fit. In other words, I better change my model to fit the data rather than the other way around, and I think that's what happens. It happened to me. A lot of this stuff has taken decades for me to evaluate, and it's not like, just once I figured it out, oh, just everything changed. No, it's like, oh, I have never really looked at this passage before. I never looked at the Genesis 6 passage about the Nephilim in any serious way until the last decade, and then I realized, oh, I was using my old interpretive framework to assume, well, that can't be, so it's not true, to look at it. And so now I'm doing the same thing with the flood. Are there inconsistencies in the flood? Well, I suppose if you're using the framework that every number has to be precise, the term 40 in the Bible is often used for a lot of different reasons. Some of them are literal and some of them aren't. So I don't know what it means here. If you, again, same thing with the numbers in the beginning of Genesis. Some of them seem to be literal. Some of them seem to be thematic. And the fact that we have, if you don't see Genesis 1 as sequential, but rather thematic, that changes the whole framework of the issue. I'm just throwing out these questions. I'm not telling you that I have the final answer. I don't at all. But I want people to have an open mind to say, all right, now I can see why somebody thinks differently about this than I do. And I can appreciate that. And brother, that's the whole issue of academic scholarship. I don't agree with you, but I do appreciate the work it took for you to get to that point. And I agree with this, and this, but I don't agree with this particular thing because I think that that your interpretive ability changed and that you made a mistake here. And let me show you why. And so that's what I write in my book review. And then this person is either going to say, yeah, actually, that's good. Thank you. You're right. I didn't think of that. Or, well, here's why I think you're interpretively wrong, etc. And of course, the goal is to try to do this and not take it personally when somebody, argues against, this point or that point. So the same thing going on here. I do not have a final answer as to how to interpret all the details in Genesis, but to me, it's a secondary issue. In the same way, and I brought this up before, that the hyperbole in Judges about not a man was left of the Canaanites in Judges chapter 4 is dashed in the next verse when a man was left, and so you've got literary hyperbole, which on a superficial level looks like a blatant contradiction, but then you miss the whole point of the story. If you're looking at the point was to show you how thorough the destruction of the Canaanites was. And I remember when I debated an atheist years ago here in Wisconsin, the atheist group came with a plaque with a bunch of Bible verses on it, and then contradictory verses right next to it. In other words, they would take a proverb and show a proverb. Then they would find another proverb that is the opposite of that proverb, and they would show, oh, the Bible contradicts this, that contradicts this. In other words, they were taking every verse out of context and placing it against another verse outside of its context to show that the Bible is inconsistent with itself. And I said, you guys are actually anti-fundamentalists. You are taking the Bible so ridiculously wooden and literal, and then you're rejecting you've superimposed your anti-fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible, and then you've rejected the interpretation that you superimposed upon it. Wow, that makes a lot of sense. And they weren't impressed with that. But so I'm trying to work through this again with the lens, with an ancient Near Eastern lens, with my infant knowledge of literary analysis. I'm beginning to look at. I read Gordon Wenham's article, and about 80% of it I had to reread and read 3 times and 4 times to say, all right, I think I sort of get what he's talking about, but I'm not going to talk about that because I really don't know what I'm talking about with it. So let me talk about the stuff that I do understand. So,
no, that makes sense. And I think sometimes we're actually open to say that a specific passage or verse is structured for literary style, but then we're not okay applying it somewhere else, right? And a lot of times it's the big ones, right? We talk about the big stories, right? Creation, the flood. But now it's not the same literary structure, but even when we went through the creation account, you have 7 days, 1, 4, 2, 5, 3, 6, rest. So then it's, I guess, but and we're okay, at least for me, and so maybe other people have the problem. Like for me, it's like, okay, I was okay doing that with the creation account and understanding, okay, well, they have to put it in God's creating the world. That's crazy in and of itself. So they're putting it in a format that would make sense to me.
Yes.
But then for some reason, I set the flood over here and I go, it can't just be literary, right?
Yeah.
So it's like we
don't think that way.
Right. So it's almost like we have certain verses or certain doctrines or theological topics that's like our baby. It's like, well, that can be true for that one.
Yeah.
But not this
for
one.
this one. Yeah, I know.
That's interesting because to me, it boils down to more of the purpose and intent of each of the stories in Genesis. And I think with anything in the Bible, it's like if you can look at it and you go, what's the main purpose? Why is the writer writing this? It's like anything. I think when we say, well, you got to look at the initial context. It's like we just say, okay, well, what city were they in and who was the audience? And it's like, but there's way more beyond that. Also, the current context is literary style. Like, again, what's like the message or what could they possibly be trying to portray? And how are they setting it up? And why are they setting it up that way? And I think for a lot of people, at least for me, that was a lot easier when I look at the creation account than the flood. But if I can understand it for the creation account, then I can at least start, it can at least be a creak in the door for me in the flood account, which is Genesis 1 makes way more sense when all of a sudden it's not, Genesis is not giving me a science textbook. It is simply telling me that they're seeking wisdom in terms of laying out order. That our God is a God of order. And now when I can look at days 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, well, 1, 2, 3. Now day 4 goes back to 1, more order.
Yes.
5 back to 2, more order. Now all of a sudden it's like, okay, it's not like it seems to just clarify and make so much more sense. And I think what you're saying is if I can look at the flood in this context, it can push some of those doubts out, but it'll also, not only will it show me the actual literary structure, not only will it get rid of what is seen as contradictions, but I think it's actually going to further help me actually understand the purpose and the theological message behind it.
Yes.
So I'm going to understand the purpose and the entire reason of why we have the flood account, and probably even add some depth and layers of why does it look similar in some places to other accounts, different in other accounts, and it's like, because I'm getting to the meaning behind it.
Yeah.
I'm reading it in context. I don't know if that spiel makes any sense.
I think it makes a lot of sense. It
at least did to me, which is why I said it. But
no, it makes a lot of sense.
Well, good. I think this is a good spot to stop.
Yeah.
And so we will we'll probably finish up with one more because Mark,
yes,
like he does. we have a laundry list of stuff he's teased you guys with, which is someday I'm going to touch on this topic. He's been teasing us about this repent verse for a long time. So we're finally going to get to it next episode.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he's been so excited.
Unless I change my mind.
Very nicely done.
Yes.
It was over some people's head until I said that. Now they're like, okay, I get it.
I get it, yes.
Well, awesome. As always, thank you so much for tuning in. Like, subscribe, share, all those fun things. Leave questions below. Well, that next one, we're going to talk about God repenting, but that's going to be the episode where we're probably going to look just big picture at the biblical Genesis. What's the purpose? And just really get to basically all the questions that I haven't asked that I've been wanting to ask. It'll be a hodgepodge of questions. I'll flood them with questions. And so, as always, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you guys next time on the Buried Bible Podcast.
All right.